As it is the season of Lent, one thing that we do each week is a reflective video that just is reminding us of that, is pointing us and reminding us of Easter and that celebration. And so let's take just a moment. We have a video to watch. This is the second Sunday of Lent. Choosing to believe, choosing to hold on to the truth of who God is in a world that is constantly trying to get us not to and trying to get us to doubt and question. It's going to go along a little bit with what we're going to be talking about today. So as we started at the first of the year going through Genesis, and our goal here is to go through Genesis and into Exodus as God gives the law to the people, and then that will transition us into celebrating Easter, because as Jesus is the fulfillment of that law. So last week we finished with the book of Genesis, and so now we're in Exodus. And if you remember, last week we talked a lot about Joseph and how Joseph was so faithful to God, and he ends up in Egypt, and then the people. The Israelite people, basically, at this point, that they're still a fairly small group, but they have been growing. They end up in Egypt due to a famine, and they settle there. And time just continues on, right? And so we're going to start off in Exodus. Excuse me, I've been saying Genesis for too long. In Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 8, it says, "Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country.' So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 'When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that it is a baby boy, kill him, but if it's a girl, let her live.' The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.' So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, 'Every Hebrew boy that is born to you, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live.'" All right, so let's stop there for a moment. Real uplifting story. And it starts off pretty bad, right? And this is kind of interesting. So what the events of Exodus, of the people, the Israelite people growing in number from Egypt and then leaving Egypt, is a seminal moment for the Jewish people. Really for us, the reason that we're here today, right? And it's kind of like you can think of, if you think of America, what is kind of one of those very pivotal moments. You could say the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? And then the Revolutionary War. Those events and the things that led up to that are, if you get rid of that, we don't exist, right? Well, if you get rid of the Exodus of this story, the people of Israel don't really exist. This is something that binds them together. And it's kind of interesting. There are historical things that point to this happening. There's evidence there. Some will try to claim that it never really happened, that we don't know for sure. And it happened so long ago, it is sketchy. It's not like we have a lot of outside sources other than the Bible. But there is some evidence that the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt and that all of this happened. The one thing that is very clear is that this has been something that is deeply, deeply rooted in the people of Israel, in the Jewish people up to this day, right? And there's something that God is doing. And I want to just take just a moment to talk about this because I do think it's important. The Jewish people, and now that we're, probably 4,000 years past this, it's a little bit different, but the Jewish people didn't start off as an ethnicity. Abraham wasn't born Jewish, right? He was called by God, right? The Jewish people, they were people who believed in God, believed in a very specific God that was very different than the other gods of the day, right? And then as that people group from Abraham, then Jewishness became an ethnicity as well. So there's kind of this combination that we have today, that there are people who are Jews because they have been, their mom was a Jew, their dad was a Jew, their granddad, all the way back, right? So it's an ethnicity, but it's also, it's what you believe in. It's that you hold a common belief. That has been fractured a little bit in the Jewish community, but the Jewish people are still a very tight-knit group. And I just want, it's interesting, and what's being laid out here is something that has happened historically to the Jewish people. And it's amazing how similar of a pattern it is. So here's Pharaoh, and he looks out, and he sees this group of people who are flourishing, right, doing well. And he gets fearful, and he starts saying, oh man, if they got too big, if there were too many of them, imagine what they could do. So we're going to start oppressing them and start killing them. That has happened repeatedly throughout history. And the ironic thing about it is that the Jewish people have never been that numerous, right? Right now, there's an estimated 14 to 15 million Jews in the world. Think about that. 14 to 15 million Jews in the world. That is nothing. I mean, that is tiny, right? And yet, this people group that has always been a small numerically has literally changed the world, right? Now, take God out of it. If you just historically took a group of people that basically only had their own nation for a few hundred years back in BC time, and that you would say, whenever we get to 2020, that they're still going to have a major influence in the world, you'd say, no way. That doesn't happen historically. So small groups that don't have their own nation, they don't survive. They don't continue on. There is something very unique about the Jewish people. And of course, I believe it is God, right? What the Jewish people were, what God did through them literally transformed the world. It really did. And it's something that we can't deny, whether you believe that it was God who was behind it or not. But to me, whenever you have this group of people who has undergone such persecution and that they continue on, I mean, whenever you think about the Holocaust, right? Remember what I said? I said there's around 15 to 16 million Jews now. 6 million were killed 80 years ago, right? I mean, normally that would wipe out a group of people, but it hasn't. Right? And I'm not saying that all Jewish people are faithful to God now. They are not. In fact, that's one of the issues is many Jews are becoming very, very secular. Right? But God has used this people, and we see it all the way back from the beginning. That's why this event is so important. And so we have Pharaoh realizing, okay, we've got to try to get rid of these people. And so used a way that we see now. China. There's a documentary out right now. If you want to learn about, we read that they wanted to kill all the babies, and we say, oh, how barbaric and it is. Yeah, China did that a few years ago. All right. So this is a way to population control, and so Pharaoh is doing that. And I'm going to come back to the Hebrew midwives are actually probably Egyptians. They're Egyptian midwives who are assigned to the Hebrews. All right. There's lots of evidence in there that's who they are. These weren't Hebrews, they were actually Egyptians, and they refuse. So Pharaoh says, why aren't you doing it? And it's interesting, they lie to Pharaoh, right? And they're rewarded for it, right? By God, which again, there's so much that we could get into, but that's a really, because they were doing the right thing, right? They were protecting life, and they were rewarded, and they did it because they feared God. All right, so that's the circumstances that are going on that brings about probably the biggest character in all of the Old Testament. So starting in chapter 2, it says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant, gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, just real quickly, that word for a papyrus basket that they use tar and pitch, that is the exact same word for Noah's Ark, right? And the Jewish teachings actually talk about how there's an intentional connection there of how Noah was saved to begin to continue God's work after just overcoming evil. Now Moses is going to be used in a similar way. And so verse 5 says, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw a basket among the reeds, sent her female slave to get it. She opened it, saw the baby. He was crying. She felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of our Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went, got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby, nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Then one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they all came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, why have you returned so early today? They answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. And where is he? Reuel asked his daughters. Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat. Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. All right. So this is the beginning of this huge event, this Exodus event that happens. And Moses is the key figure. And you know, you think about Moses and what he kind of, I mean, he was the perfect person for this. It was as if God was working through all of the difficulty to bring about something good, right? So Moses is born into a time where the little boys are supposed to be killed, and yet he's rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, right, who shows mercy, right? And this is an aside. Isn't it amazing how much evil can be done by one person? We don't like to think about that, but not all of the Egyptians hated the Hebrews. But when the king, the one who has power over everybody, when he does, it filters down to other people. But you still see the goodness of people trying to do what is right. And here's Pharaoh's daughter recognizing, you know what, no. And so she takes Moses, raises him as her own. There's still clearly a connection with Moses and with his people. He would have known that he was a Hebrew. And as he gets older, he goes out and he sees injustice happening, right? He sees one of the slaves being beaten by the slave master, and he steps in, and it gets ugly, right? And it makes sense if you put it in a practical setting. If there's a slave master who is beating a slave and you try to go stop that, you're probably not going to just be able to talk the guy out of it. There's probably going to be an altercation, right? So it's not like Moses was just looking for, who can I kill today, right? He saw a unjust circumstance and he intervened. And in fact, nowhere does the Bible ever specifically condemn what Moses did, right? And it's very interesting. And Moses, you start to see, is this guy who actually is willing to stand up against injustice. And that's rare, right? And it's interesting, in these first few verses, you see three distinct examples. The first one, where the slave is getting beaten, Moses goes, and it's very active, right? And someone loses their life, but Moses is intervening. Then the next day, he sees two Hebrews arguing, and that it's clearly getting very dangerous and uncomfortable. So he steps in. He says, "Hey, what's going on? Why are we doing this?" Right? And then he realizes, now more people know what I've done, and because stepping up against injustice doesn't always lead to good things, right? And so he decides, man, I better leave, and so he leaves. And then, interestingly, he comes across a group of random women who are being harassed by the men of that day, right? And he stands up for them as well. He has a habit that you see of him standing up for the oppressed over and over and over again. That is why he was chosen by God. He was the man that God chose who would later go and stand face to face to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go," right? Because he was willing to stand up against that injustice. He was willing to stand up. He was willing to enter into those situations. That is really hard for us to do, right? But it is something that we should be standing up against injustice, right? And I think about it. I'm like, how does that happen? How was Moses able to do that? And we're going to see more about that. We're going to learn more of Moses' character as we continue. But I think when it comes down to it, is that Moses had a fear of the Lord. Right? I want you to remember what we read at the very beginning, talking about the midwives to the Hebrews. Right? So Pharaoh asked them to go and to get rid of all the males who are born. Right? And it specifically says the reason that they lied to Pharaoh, the reasons that they would not do that, is because they feared the Lord. Right? We don't like the term fear of the Lord anymore. Right? You know, used to, if someone was a devout person of faith, a normal way of referring to them would be, that is a very God-fearing person. Right? We don't like that because we hear that and it gives a lot of people negative connotations of God, right? Because, oh, well, God's going to strike me down. God is this wrathful, vengeful, mean God, and that's why we fear him. And I would actually agree that if that's what you're thinking of whenever you hear the word fear of the Lord or God-fearing, that is not healthy. That's not what that's trying to do. But if we don't have a fear of the Lord, you don't understand who the Lord is. Right? I mean, we're talking about the being who created the world, who created us, who has the power to destroy, the power to create. Now, he's chosen to enter into a relationship with us that is a loving relationship. But he is, if that's not a little bit terrifying whenever you think of the big picture of who God is, then you really don't understand the power of who God is. And here's why it's so important to have a healthy fear, and it's kind of a combination of a fear and a respect and a not wanting to disappoint, right? That you fear God enough that you want to do what is right, right? That was with my dad. I've used this example before. I never feared that my dad was going to come beat me. But man, I wanted to do what was right because to honor him, right? If we don't have that for God, guess what? We're going to do it for somebody else. Because whoever you fear will become your master. Whatever you fear, it doesn't have to be a person, whatever you fear will become your master. I think what's going on right now is perfect. If you're scared to death of getting COVID-19, it will become your master. You will put mask on. You will lather yourself in antibiotic ointment. You will put a bubble on, right? I'm going obviously to the extreme.
That's good.
But if that is what you fear above all else, if that's what you fear above all else, it's going to dictate how you live, right? We see this all the time. How do you think that Pharaoh was able to get the people under him to go and beat the Hebrew slaves? They feared him more than anything else. How do you think Hitler got normal, everyday German people to go and throw Jews into an incinerator? Because they were more scared of Hitler than they were of anything else, right? And then you start rationalizing, and then some of those people were evil tendencies anyway, and then it just all of a sudden becomes crazy, right? But if you fear the Lord above all else, you can stand up to injustice when others can't. Those midwives to the Hebrew people, ironically and unbelievably, they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And so they did what was right, knowing that they could get tossed in the Nile River just as easily as the babies that they were told to toss in there. But they chose to do the right thing because they feared God. I think that is so important in our culture today because we're getting to a place where we're replacing God with a lot of different things, right? And what is it that you fear the most? If you fear the government the most, guess what you're going to submit to? You're going to submit to the government no matter what, right? And all of a sudden, we don't stand up for injustice. Right? This is not an easy thing, and we're not always going to make the right choice. And this doesn't mean that we don't fear and have a respect for other things as well. You should wash your hands. You should take precautions against disease and things like that. But who we fear is going to dictate ultimately how we live. And I think it is so important for us to explore and to understand, what does that mean for us to fear the Lord? For me, I fear not living out what God has called me to live out. And I know I'm not going to do that perfectly, but whenever I get that chance to meet God, however that's going to look, that terrifies me to think that I knew what I was supposed to do, but yet wouldn't do it. Right? I also fear on being on the wrong side of who God is and what God is trying to do in the world and trying to figure that out. Right? It is so important for us to have a fear of the Lord. If we do not, I promise you, you will not stand up and do what you're supposed to do in the most difficult situations. Yes. Amen. Right? We can live a pretty good life with no fear of the Lord. And we can follow a lot of the things that God has called us to do without a fear of the Lord. But when it comes to actually standing up against injustice, what you fear is going to be your master. And I encourage you to develop a healthy fear of the Lord, a respect for him, because he is the one who walks with us no matter what happens. He walks with the Jewish people through the last 3,000 years, through slaveries, through all kinds of horrific events. But he continues to walk with them, and he's going to continue to walk with us. Let's go to him in prayer. Let's pray.